Hello everyone, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at History Summarized England by Overly Sarcastic Productions. So this should be interesting. English history is not one of my strong suits, but I know the broad strokes, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, let's go.
Names are hard, especially when it comes to the British Isles. The island of Britain is home to England, Scotland, and Wales, while the island of Ireland is composed of the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom's Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I can see how this is a bit confusing for some, especially foreigners, of course. But I've never had much trouble with this personally, but that's just me, I guess.
Ireland. This is not only a nightmare to keep track of, but as we've seen, this is all subject to change, probably a little sooner than we think. I say all this to clarify what we're actually going to be talking about in this video. England. Now, not only is England not Britain, but its history is plenty interesting all its own. So, to see how England grew from a simple Roman province to the master of Britain and a major world power, let's do some history. Our earliest documentation for England comes with the arrival of Julius Cheekbone Caesar, who crossed over from Gaul in 55 BC. The native Celts were...
Yes, Caesar's invasion of Britain, or Britannia as it was called back then, was just a propaganda thing, really. He was the first Roman general to set foot on the Isles, and it was a big political coup for him. Back home, it was seen as a remarkable feat, but strategically or militarily didn't mean very much.
None too pleased with their new neighbors, so Rome kind of stalled for a century until Emperor Claudius established the province of Britannia. Roman influence on the island was rather slim outside of the main port cities. Since it was hard enough to schlep all those armies across the channel, they were happy to delegate certain responsibilities to the local kings.
This was a common Roman thing to do. When they didn't want to govern something themselves, they established some client kingdoms and let them rule themselves, provided they contributed troops and some taxes or tax revenue, in some cases at least. But yeah, the Romans were happy to let the tribes govern themselves. It's too much trouble to go out there and civilize, quote unquote.
In 60 AD, one such client king bequeathed half of his lands to Rome, but when the empire glommed all of it anyway, the late king's wife Boudica led a rebellion that burned through...
Boudica's revolt is a very famous revolt against Roman rule in Britannia. And yeah, although it was doomed to fail from the onset, because, you know, you're facing the Roman Empire here, it's remarkable, especially because it was led by a woman, which is quite unusual, you have to say, at this time.
Several eastern cities, including Londinium, before she was defeated in battle. Later, Romans expanded outwards to the edge of Caledonia before Hadrian said nope and built a wall across the island to stop any hotshot general from getting ideas.
Hadrian's Wall. The name comes from the Roman Emperor Hadrian, of course, so one of the 5 good emperors. And Hadrian was very careful in his foreign policy, in that he preferred consolidation of existing borders rather than more expansion that is untenable.
The benefit of Britannia's insulation was that it didn't see much disruption from the carousel of imperial civil wars, but the downside was that Britannia was the first province to be cut loose when the barbarians started rolling up in the fourth.
It should be said that Rome actually expanded further northwards, building the Antonine Wall, but those lands proved to be even less uncivilized and hard to govern, and so the Romans gave up on that idea fairly quickly.
Hundreds. The next several centuries are marked by a constant shuffling between small Romano-Britannic kingdoms and a tidal wave of Northern European newcomers. The polite term for this is disorganized, and the accurate term for this is gross. The early medieval period saw raids and migrations from Picts, Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, and while the map doesn't stop fidgeting with its borders anytime soon, the players get a little clearer by the late 600s. Here we can see 7 major Anglisk and Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Those last 3 being East, South, and West Saxony, in case you were wondering why England sexed up so many of its...
Yeah, that's pretty good to know. And many of these names, all of these, I believe all of these names remain and Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex. Oh, that remains. I'm not sure about Mercia, maybe. But yeah, these are still provinces in England, so that's where they got their names from, I guess.
Its place names. These kingdoms weren't entirely Britannic nor fully Germanic. Just like the Romans, it was a case of gradual integration between lots of small and unique groups of people, sometimes friendly, sometimes stabby. For a dash of literary context, the legendary character of King Arthur is set specifically against the backdrop of these Germanic migrations. Historically speaking, our record gets a little clearer in the Christian monasteries of Northumbria, where the scholar Bede wrote the Ecclesiastical History of England, our best source for this period. And monasteries all across Northumbria were becoming magnificent palaces of literature and art throughout the 600s and 700s. Northumbria can have a little bit of a golden age, as a treat. The good news is that this was really shiny, but the bad news is that maybe this was a little bit too shiny, as the glittering attracted our old pals the Vikings, who rolled up to the island monastery of Lindisfarne to save the priceless relics from the totally unrelated fires that started burning right as the Vikings arrived. Weird.
Totally unrelated fires. Yeah, the Viking invasion of Lindisfarne is very famous, and it marks the really beginning of the Viking expansion into England.
There, the Vikings kept on coming, raiding all up and down the coasts and even heading inland with the Great Heathen Army. This was especially bad news for the King of Wessex, who was partway through conquering Mercia when the Scandinavians glomped their way down the eastern coast. They didn't have the means or the interest to form a single unified state, but the laws of these incoming Danes held sway over a pretty beefy stretch of land. So we call this thingy the Dane Law because when historians aren't creative, they're at least direct. Well, the Dane
Yes, historians are really bad at naming historical events and wars and battles, and they're very unimaginative, but at least they are direct, so you understand fairly immediately what it's about.
Law became a shiny mercantile midpoint between Ireland and Scandinavia. It was soon reverso-glomped by the Kingdom of Wessex. By 927, King Ethelstan had conquered all the way to Northumbria and began to style himself as King of England. So now, finally, we can actually discuss England as a single state. In the century following, Northumbria played hopscotch between English and Viking rule, and some wacky royal gymnastics resulted in the Scandinavian Canute becoming King of England, Denmark, and Norway for 2 decades. But despite the near constant
Yes, and this was not at all common between the Nordic kingdoms, at least. They intermarried a lot, and that resulted in some personal unions being formed. And if you happen to control parts of England on top of that, well, all the better.
Higher fire of Scandinavian invasions and an extremely squiggly royal lineage, England had become impressively well run for the time, as the governing bureaucracy was organized and they knew how taxes worked. Not bad. But,
as they say, there are only 2 things certain here in life, and that is death and taxes. And it was true then as it is now.
Become a running theme in the next few centuries, there's no getting over that pesky question of royal succession. After the death of King Edward in 1066, the crown passed to Harold Godwinson, but 2 other parties wanted that shiny headwear for themselves, namely King Harold Hardrada of Norway and Duke William of Normandy. Hardrada arrived to challenge Godwinson for the title of one true herald, but was beaten at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. However, Godwinson's luck ran out 1 month later when
anime references here.
And that's the Norman conquest in a nutshell.
Yeah, so Harold Godwinson was very unlucky in the fact that he had to fight Harold Hardrada first at Stamford Bridge. He won a smashing victory, but that left him weakened for the Battle of Hastings that would come later when William the Conqueror sailed over from Normandy. And actually, it looked like Godwinson might actually win the Battle of Hastings for some time there, but eventually William managed to defeat him and claim the English crown as his own, and that is that's seen as by many as the beginning point of quote-unquote more modern English history.
In contrast to the other assorted cases of England being conquered, this one had lasting significance. Firstly, William was set on keeping his hot new kingdom, so he invented this little doohickey called a castle and built them all over England to protect his armies from the odd revolt. Meanwhile, he replaced the English aristocracy with freshly imported Norman barons. Now, the Normans, being from France, were French, so they spoke their native language instead of the local Old English. Over the centuries, these two languages smushed into each other to create what we recognize as English, our
Yep.
beautiful disaster of a language. The last significant consequence was that William was still Duke of Normandy, and his supervisor, the King of France, was a little miffed that he went and yoinked himself a kingdom.
Yes, the William's conquest of England created quite a curious situation in which William was, and his descendants, were the Dukes of Normandy who paid homage to the French king in Paris. But at the same time, they held the crown of England. And this was a very awkward situation for all involved, I would imagine. Should a English king bow down to a French king? No, but he was also the Duke of Normandy, and if that's the case, he should. Yeah, this was a situation that would, not be resolved peacefully, as you can imagine.
And this diplomatic hiccup would embroil England and France in a casual 600-year-long rivalry. Now, this is normally the point where English history slavishly trails along the royal family tree through all its twists and turns, but this video is a summary, and I don't care about kings. Royal gymnastics are far too dull to be this needlessly confusing. I say this now so we can skip the faff later on. What matters to us here in the middle 1100s is that the royal family married across the channel, so now the King of England became the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Aquitaine. England has never been taller. This Angevin period rewrites Anglo-Frankish.
Yeah, this period is called the Angevin Empire period, where England or the English king actually controlled several duchies in France, which created an awkward situation for the French king where half of his country belonged to the English king. And this was not an ideal situation, which would lead to the 100 Years' War. Spoilers.
Relations to the tune of "you got chocolate in my peanut butter." Anywho, with this absurdly large tax base and access to half of France load of natural resources up and down the Atlantic coast, the Angevin Empire was an economic powerhouse. Of course, money means rich people, and rich people means armed robberies, so this period is the main historical setting for the legends of Robin Hood, most closely associated with the reign of the crusading King Richard the Lionheart at the turn of the 13th century. Speaking of military stuff, England took this opportunity to hop westward and glomp onto the Dublin-y part of Ireland. They tried for more, but they didn't really get much else. Conquest is all well.
And I'm sure the conquest of Ireland would cause no controversies in the future. Yeah, we all know that relations between England and Ireland, and later Britain and Ireland, is anything but straightforward, plagued by savage conflicts, and it's a whole quagmire that we don't need to get into right now, but suffice it to say, the English conquest and domination of Ireland began very early on. And I think people often forget that the English domination of Ireland began so early.
Good, but it's also expensive, and France was itching to get the rest of its France back, so the early 1200s saw Normandy, Anjou, and most of Aquitaine go poof. Meanwhile, the barons were fed up with the monarchy, that makes two of us, so they forced a few kings to sign a contract recognizing that teamwork makes the dream work. As in, the Magna Carta makes kings consult their barons, and this puts us on track to get Parliament a ways down the line.
The Magna Carta is, of course, one of the most famous documents and most important documents of all time, and it became a symbol and inspiration of liberty for many constitutions and founding documents to come. The American Constitution took great inspiration from the Magna Carta, for example. And basically it established the playing rules, protecting the church rights, protecting the rights of the nobles, and so on. And it led to the formation of, as he said, the Parliament of England later down the line. And it would continue to be an important document to look back on. And it's extremely fortunate for us that we still have several copies of it in its entirety, which is unbelievable when it comes to documents as old as these are.
Elsewhere in Britain, King Edward Longshanks conquered the Kingdom of Wales and glomped onto Scotland for a hot second, but they broke free. The problem for England was that Scotland had allied with France, and by the mid-1300s, France was in a century.
Yes, I believe it's called the Old Alliance. The alliance between Scotland and France was mutually beneficial, to be sure, and it was a long-standing alliance that would create headaches for many English rulers throughout the centuries. And of course, this was very beneficial if conflicts broke out in France between the English possessions there in Angevin, or rather in Aquitaine. Well, then the Scots would invade from the north, or vice versa. So it was a very strong strategic alliance that put English rulers in quite an awkward and uncomfortable position.
Long win streak. King Edward III was a big fan of the part where England owned half of France, so he went for broke and claimed a right to the French kingship to justify a continental invasion.
Edward III, perhaps one of the greatest English kings, had legitimate claims through the maternal line to the French throne. And English kings would continue to have good claims on the French throne, though they were never able to really enforce that. And the closest one was Henry V, who was very, very close to inheriting the title of King of France, but he died like a month before the French king did. So yeah. And though the title passed to his son, with child rulers, they have a hard time enforcing their rights to power and claims and all that, because they're so young. And yeah, they never got the King of France title, really.
Strategy. It won't work, but it took a century for that to become apparent. From 1337 to 1453, England and France were locked in 100 Years' War. Edward oversaw the first act.
Yeah, it's called the 100 Years' War, but it's sort of a misnomer because the war didn't last 100 years. Rather, it's a series of wars during a 116-year period between France and England primarily, but there were others involved too. And historians, for simplicity's sake, have decided to group all of these conflicts into one long 100 Years' War. But it's important to remember the fact that there were long periods of truce between these two countries, and hostilities were on and off for about this century. So, just keep that in mind.
Where the English poured across the Channel and thrashed the French army at the Battle of Crécy. To explain why, we've got to dig into the real juicy stuff. Economics. Alright, look, I minored in econ. I have to at least pretend like this was worth something, okay? It all comes down to how they collected taxes. England had the sophistication to tax money and put it towards a professional army, while France took payment in goods and conscription, so their army was bigger, sure, but far weaker.
France was still running quite a feudal system at this time, where taxes were collected in the form of goods and not money, which, as they said, led to some advantages for the English, who could field a professional army instead.
England's advance would have pressed on were it not for the surprise guest appearance of plague. Soon after the fighting resumed, the new French...
The Black Death really put a hold on hostilities, and, because the armies died of plague, and the taxpayers also died of plague, which meant there was not enough money to fund an expedition, at least from the English side, to invade France and continue the conquests.
King Charles V had a much better time than his predecessor and pushed the English out to the edges of Gascony and Calais. The third phase of the war is the spicy stuff that shows up in all those Shakespeare plays. We're talking Battle of Agincourt, Henry V, Hella Longbows, take that, Frenchies! After the loss, France fell into a civil war and almost collapsed until Joan Kick-Ass d'Arc arrived to absolutely steamroll the...
Joan of Arc, or as I prefer to refer to her, Jeanne d'Arc, the French pronunciation, is, of course, one of the most famous histories, one of the most famous female figures in history. She is now regarded as the patron saint of France, and she's actually canonized by the Catholic Church. But she is very well known for the fact that she led French armies to several victories, especially at the Siege of Orleans, and she was very much appreciated by the French king, of course, who saw this as a rallying figure. Although later on, she would be turned over to the English, and then she would be burned at the stake for, heresy and the blasphemy for wearing men's clothes and armor and all that nonsense. And eventually, the Catholic Church overturned the verdict. Well, she had been dead for 20 years at that point, but yeah. And she became a very popular symbol of the French nation during the revolutionary period in France during the 1790s. And yeah, like I said, she is now a saint of the Catholic Church, a very venerated one indeed.
English. King Henry VI had exactly 0 ways to handle this, so England got swept right on out of there. By 1453, all they had left was a tiny little sliver of Calais. Despite the war's overt goal of conquer France, it inadvertently cemented a distinct English identity through language, national heroes, and insular geography. The other major consequence was, big shock, another succession crisis. I've covered the War of the Roses before, and I respect you too much to bore you with this.
The War of the Roses is a very complicated series of conflicts between the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions, and we don't need to get into it all too much here. Like you said, it's quite boring at times. But yeah, it served actually apparently as the inspiration of the Game of Thrones series, and you can clearly see the contrasts and likeness. So yeah, that's just an interesting fact, I guess. But yeah, let's not get into the War of the Roses. It's a mess.
All that matters is that a king died and two families spent a century stabbing each other over who would.
That's a good summary.
Plot twist, both of them. Big ups to Henry VII for marrying the houses of York and Lancaster together to create the Tudor dynasty and resolve that mess for good. The Tudors managed to accomplish quite a bit in their century-long runtime. The first order of business for King Henry VIII was to formalize the rules for royal succession, presumably because he had to read about the War of the Roses and decided never again. But he also had outside problems, as King Charles of Spain and
yeah, Henry's motivation for turning England into a Protestant country looks on surface at least to be quite selfish. He wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, I believe, and the Pope would not grant him papal dispensation for this divorce. Usually that was just a formality. The Pope would usually grant dispensation to kings who wanted to get divorced, but in this case, our dear friend here, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful figures in all of European history, had the Pope under his thumb, and for various reasons, he did not want Henry to get a divorce. Because, he was also the King of Spain, and Catherine of Aragon was from Spain, so you could see why he was all too inclined to grant Henry's wish. And as a result, he broke away from the Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and as such could annul the marriage however he wished. Very convenient, isn't it? Oh, and as a side note, this allowed him to confiscate the vast riches of the monasteries and the churches, and use it for his own purposes. Just a convenient added benefit, I guess.
The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, coincidentally the same Charlie, was getting a smidge overpowered since he put the Pope under house arrest. Further complicating matters was the little fact that Henry's first wife was also Charles's aunt, and she wasn't bearing any male heirs. Henry deftly solved the three problems of Charles, the Pope, and his wife in one move by going diet Protestant and forming his own church. This new Church of England didn't really lean that hard into Protestant theology, but the real swerve was that the church answered only to the king. This quasi-reformist compromise wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world to enforce, but the Tudors made it work. Meanwhile, back in geopolitics land, Henry made a new push into Ireland, and tried, and failed, to bully Scotland into uniting with England.
Yeah, trying to conquer England proved to be difficult for the French kings, or the English kings, the French kings. well, they still claim the title King of France, I believe, to this point, so I'm not entirely wrong. But yeah, the Protestant Reformation proved to be very hard to enforce, like they said. Most English people had been Catholic for centuries at this point, and suddenly Henry VIII decides to do away with all of it. And it took quite a long time before Protestantism really got entrenched in England.
The second half of the century, Queen Elizabeth I held the fort against an increasingly aggressive Spain, way too hyped on conquistador cash to remember what hubris means. In 1588, Spain hucked an armada at England in the hopes of conquering it, but English cannons and English weather smashed the fleet to bits. When Elizabeth...
The Spanish Armada was a very impressive fleet that was to invade England and depose Elizabeth I. But the Spanish had bad luck with the weather, and that's basically the reason why they were annihilated. Of course, Britain had, at this point, a fairly good navy, I would say, but that was not the main reason they won.
Died without an heir, the crown passed to her nearest male relative, who happens to be King James VI of Scotland. So in 1603, James became King of Scotland and England.
Yeah, and he's very confusing because he's James I in England, but James VI in Scotland. But conveniently, it's important to remember here, though, that the crowns of England and Scotland remained separate. This was not the formation of Great Britain or United Kingdom, for that matter. It was still separate kingdoms, but for all intents and purposes, it was one nation at this point.
Everything after the Union of the Crowns is the Britain plotline, where they glomp all the Isles, make an empire, all that Rule Britannia jazz. So this is where we'll wrap our history of England. And I'll be fully honest, sagas like this give history a bad rap. At a glance, it's a 1600-year-long nightmare that's stuffed with more monarchs than anybody should be forced to remember. And it's easy to get bogged down in any one episode or to lose track entirely. But the good news is that just because English historians are sadistically meticulous and blindingly self-obsessed doesn't mean that we have to be. Because if we zoom out a little bit and focus on England as a unit rather than a backdrop for royal gymnastics, the important kings will make sense in context and we avoid getting bogged down in the details. So then we can clearly see the macro plot progression from Roman province through the Heptarchy into the conflicts with France and out towards the formation of Britain. So let English history show why the big picture is often the clearest and also serve as an object lesson in the historiographic benefits of restraint. Thank you so much for watching.
I can't oppose anything he said there. He made some very good points about historiography there. And yes, earlier studies of history focused very much on the history of kings and queens and really misses a whole lot else that is very interesting. And yeah, fortunately we've gotten away from that in the 2000s and 19... well, not only the 2000s, but in the more modern period, so to speak. But yeah, that was the history of England summarized by Overly Sarcastic Productions. I hope you enjoyed my reaction to it, and if you liked the video, please leave a like, leave a comment if you had more context. I'm not an expert on English history by any means, but like I said, I have a fair grasp of the broad strokes at least. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.